Welcome everyone to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. So, one interesting update to mention, we now officially have a Patreon. The main reason why I decided to finally bite the bullet and make one is because I feel like given the incredible guests that I somehow managed to get, like James Lindsay, Colin Wright, Katie Herzog, Michael Shermer, Benjamin Boyce, and many more, there's gotta be some expectation of quality that I don't think I've met. So whatever money I do get, which I don't expect to even get my first Patreon for a while, but any money that I do get will go directly to funding better equipment, such as video editing software, video cameras, lighting, whatever it may be. I'm a broke college student, so I'm afraid I don't have the luxury of being able to afford these type of things. So hopefully it'll help. Anyways, today we're joined by Colin Wright. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology. He's the managing editor at Quillette. He rose in popularity due to his seemingly benign position that sex is binary, a position that I found myself amazed at by the fact that there's been a heavy amount of books published recently attempting to refute it. So we talk about the recent American election, political polarization, critical race theory, the rules of political engagement, and more. It was great having him on. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend and co-host, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on this podcast.
Very excited to be here.
We're joined today by Dr. Colin Wright. I know not many people I see referring to him as that, but he deserves that moniker because he has a PhD in evolutionary biology, no longer in the academy for reasons that we could probably discuss. But if you've listened to the previous podcast to which he's been on, we've gone into that in great length. He's the current managing editor at Quillette. Colin Wright, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me back for the third time now.
Yeah, that's right. So there's two people that we've had on 3 times now. The other person is James Lindsay, who's also a doctor, actually, in mathematics, and you as well. So I think this is actually, you could probably already sense a pattern there, the type of conversations, the type of conversations that we engage in. And so I'm really glad you're here because you're one of the few people out there that I can point towards and show that this person is anti-woke, but he hasn't become right wing. There's very few of us at this point, and even the people who do go right wing, I still have great respect for them. I think they do great work, but we just have disagreements on where to align with politically. And so, based on what you've and I'm assuming this based on what you've tweeted, right? You seem to be sympathetic towards the Sam Harris Trump route, I guess. If not sympathetic, at the very least, you recognize that Trump represents something sinister about the political process as well as ourselves, maybe. But if we're strictly focusing on the woke aspect of things, right? So politically speaking, in the grand scheme of things, what happened after the election, if we're specifically focusing on the people who are concerned about who's president based on the way that they view wokeness, ignoring the politics of the economy, the socialization of policies, foreign policy, ignoring all that stuff. Not that we should ignore it, but rather that because there are people who do ignore it and strictly focus on the woke aspect of the situation, maybe we should at least address that. So strictly focusing on the ramifications that who the president is going to have on society. Do you think Biden was the right choice?
That's just been the question I've been asking myself so much over the last months leading up to the whole election. You know, I could actually see equally valid pathways to things getting worse and things getting better under either presidency. Like there's reasonable ways to think that, you know, if Trump were in the White House and that he'd be maintaining his ban on critical race theory or something like that, since he's the only person I know in politics who's really outwardly just like named the issue and has made steps to combat it. That's, you know, we want more of that. And then there's, on the other hand, you have the argument that, you know, he's just so volatile and polarizing that in a sense he's just gonna ramp up the whole problem with this wokeness, and just because Trump's the one that's sort of the only one pushing back just because it's got the Trump seal of approval on it, that it's just going to make everyone go crazy, and we can't have actual discussions about the topic, because if I start talking about critical race theory and how I'm against it, I'm going to be associated with being a Trump supporter and all these things. And so I don't pretend to know which option is actually going to turn out to be the best. And what's unfortunate is that we can't, we can only view this single timeline. And so even if things get much worse under Biden, we can't do that comparative and compare the counterfactuals of how things would have gone under Trump or any of these things. So it's an impossible thing to think about. And at the end of the day, as much as I am extremely worried about the whole problem with wokeness generally, there's other factors too that come into my vote. I consider myself on the left mostly politically, and so I think things like healthcare are really important. So that's a big factor. So I mean, in the end, I didn't vote for either Trump or Biden. I voted for Tulsi. I wrote her in. So in a way, I can just be like, I stepped out of it. But if I had to choose between, if I was forced to pick, I would have voted for Biden, just to get the toxic environment sort of out of the system. I just think things would be really difficult to make any progress with Trump in the White House. And I don't like this narrative that the president matters so much that if we lose the presidency, or if the presidency is taken over by someone who's sympathetic to wokeness or something, then disaster is going to happen. The strategy can't be president or bust. I think it's going to be more of a cultural thing that we need to do. And, you're not going to solve cultural issues with a president. At the end of the day, we need to be persuasive. We need to try to change people's minds. It's going to be a longer battle, but I think that's the way it has to be fought, just sort of the boots on the ground, engaging in this whole persuasion. Having a president helps for sure, keeping it out of the government, because once it's in, it's hard to get out. But I don't think we need to just be like going all in on who's president, and that's the only way that we can save the situation.
Well, an incentive people had to vote for Trump was, as you said, were for his executive orders against CRT, and this election was a little bit more wild, I think, than most people expected, and that's an understatement considering the circumstances that we're now currently in. I mean, but I think people were scared enough by CRT, including liberals like ourselves, to have secretly cast their votes for someone that we all despise, because where else are you going to find a bulwark against this? And, Sarah Hyder pretty much put my thoughts into words when she said on Twitter that she was satisfied at Trump's loss, but she was really not excited about the prospect of the Democrats coming into play, because how CRT has just infected the left. Now, I've asked Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi, what was Trump's executive orders against CRT and net loss or net gain? And on the podcast, it was more like a net loss, because Trump is such a despised figure because of his commentary, because of his actions. He's thought of as a racist, and because he's labeled in that fashion, his actions against CRT is going to be easily framed as, this guy doesn't want diversity, this guy doesn't want equality among people. But so people who would ordinarily be against the extremes of CRT are now for it, because for obvious reasons. They think that we're pushing back against racism, and we are to that extent, but we're just taking it to such an extreme. It endangers the fundamental values that we all enjoy. Now, do you think that the Trump's actions were a net loss or a net gain?
I would put them as a net gain, but really? For the fact that, so I think calling it out by name and putting it on the cultural radar of everyone, I think that was extremely useful, because I don't think anyone in the general population would have known what critical race theory was. The conversation wasn't happening in any sort of mainstream level. It was taking place on, sort of podcasts and alternative media networks and places on Twitter. I think it's a net gain that Trump called it out, and he was looking like he lost the election, because I think it would be a net negative if, by calling it out and then Trump's the one who needs to sort of carry this across the finish line. I don't think he's the one to carry that torch any further. I think him carrying the torch would just be disastrous for it, because it's always going to have sort of his taint on it, basically. So I like that it was called out by name, and then I like that now he's going to be gone, because maybe we can have more culturally relevant conversations on this without having sort of Trump in the scene to just sort of be that polarizing figure and polarize every conversation on the topic.
That's a really interesting take on it. I didn't think about it that way before, and that's actually what I want to talk about next. So we had election night, which it gave everyone a heart attack again. Yeah. I watched Kyle Kalinski's on the show on occasion, and it looks like he was correct. On election night, we saw what he called the red mirage. All the states were turning red, because that's when the mail-in votes are overwhelmingly Democratic. Most Republican votes will come in, will be in person, and we ended up seeing it. Like, Trump's collection of votes were not insubstantial, but they were not, when it came down to it, they weren't the majority of the votes. And we see that California didn't pass Prop 16. That there was no mandate to make sure every single policy you had to look at someone's race rather than treat everyone on a colorblind basis. And this is in a very liberal state. We had Biden as a nominee, which was pretty much a middle finger to the far left. We see Trump increase the number of votes he got through a number of minorities. And there are people coming out now saying that the genius idea of defunding the police, or marketing it that way instead of reform the police, that hurt the Democratic prospects for our candidate. And not most everyone, but like a fair number of people I know and who I respect say that this is a good sign, because it's a repudiation of the woke left. So there might be a chance for the reasonable left to reemerge. Now we have Biden's victory, and we have an indication that minorities voted for Trump, which blows a hole that we're infected by quote unquote whiteness. So I'm inclined to agree, but I'm really not convinced. What's your stance on that?
On just sort of what the election said in regards to sort of the narratives of the woke ideology or something, or what's the
was it a clear sign, or did it indicate that saying, like, you know what, we are indeed liberal, but we are not woke?
Yeah, I think it did really show that sort of a lot of moderates came through, and that we can't use things like social media to be a good barometer of where the country is sort of mentally and how they think about these issues. I think I remember reading somewhere that the Biden campaign, one of the reasons they did so well is because in the end is because they really didn't pay attention to Twitter. They thought the sort of the population was in a different headspace than social media might lead them to believe. And so they basically just, they would tweet every once in a while, but they weren't looking at what was coming back, and they didn't use Twitter as sort of this indicator of what issues they need to be focusing on. I think, a lot of the sort of narratives you see on the left are sort of breaking down. I mean, I think the only group Trump did worse with, if I remember, is with white men, and he made gains in every other demographic, every other demographic minority group. He doubled the amount of votes he got from the LGBT community, increased anywhere between like 5 and 10% almost every minority across the board. So I mean, you wouldn't expect that if he was the true, white supremacist dictator that everyone had been saying that he was this entire time. And I think it is a repudiation of a lot of these woke ideas that, that this racism is everywhere, and that we need to just sort of double down on these narratives of systemic racism and things like that. Now, it's not a complete repudiation. I mean, Biden did win, but it's not like there was no wave either way. So I'm kind of happy with the result in general, because when people ask me what would be my ideal outcome, it's, I guess, a pretty centrist take. I wanted Biden to win the presidency, and I wanted the Republicans to keep the Senate. And it looks like, depending on what happens in Georgia, that's most likely to be the case. Because I don't want any one side to just have, just to have total power and be able to just bulldoze through, the Congress or anything like that. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see some sort of moderation. Because I don't think, Biden's not a woke candidate. Everyone worries that he's going to be controlled by woke people, and maybe that'll be the case. I'll wait for that to actually emerge before I respond to it. Yeah, I'm just trying not to be alarmist as a lot of people I see on social media are, where they think this is just the worst possible outcome that Biden won. I'm optimistic, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think there's truth in the meme that comes out that the people who are so tremendously woke are usually just white people being woke on behalf of people of color. It's like, and they show polls like the vast majority of Hispanics hate the term Latinx. They, but I want to bring into light something and probe deeper on the idea that you brought forth, that at the very least what Trump did with critical race theory, by naming it and by taking an oppositional stance towards it, he at least brought this into the public consciousness. And what I want to ask you is, in regards to that, is that, do you also run the risk, if you do this and it's only done so by one political party, do you not run the risk of politicizing the issue, especially if it's someone like Trump? I think we'd be having a very different conversation of someone like Mitt Romney if he won the election, that he would have, back in 2012, that he would have, if he brought it up, it wouldn't have been anywhere nearly as politicized and as one-sided as it is now that Trump brought it up. Now, instead of it being an issue that Donald Trump brought into the limelight, in which people can look at it and go, oh wow, this is something that we really should be talking about. Instead, what he did was he showed something, critical race theory. And because most people really only analyze situations on the periphery of it, they don't dig deep into what critical race theory is. They don't read the historical analysis of where it came from. They really just see it as, okay, what is it? It's okay, anti-racist policies. Yeah, that sounds good. So I guess and Donald Trump is against it. Of course, obviously Donald Trump would be against it. Don't we also run the risk of of that happening? Of now it's I think of back like what happened with climate change with Al Gore. Climate change should have never been a political issue, because that was something that was overwhelmingly scientifically proven to be true. And so, but because Al Gore made it a platform, now we have to undergo, we're still dealing with the ramifications of it being a politicized issue. Are you concerned that that's going to happen with Trump?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a chance that his name is forever going to be associated with any sort of ban on critical race theory and things like that. I think it is troubling that if this is only picked up by one of the parties. But ultimately, I think, we can't confuse Democrats and Republicans for just sort of the general population, because I know a lot of people who are Democrats who are against critical race theory. So there is a disconnect between like actual party platforms and what individual voters in each of these parties are actually think to some degree. So I think we need to engage in sort of the changing minds and persuasion as much as we possibly can on this issue. There's no other way out, really. I mean, we're kind of, this is where we are. I can see the argument of, I'm glad that Trump called it out by name, but at the same time, Trump called it out by name, and it's always going to have that sort of that stink that's on it. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully moving forward, he'll be more of a distant memory, and it'll lose his name won't forever be associated with it. And if you actually look at the executive order too, it might mention critical race theory, but it doesn't specifically ban critical race theory. It bans very specific sort of actions and ways of thought. Like it bans, I think it's like sexist and racist stereotyping and scapegoating, if you actually look at the words of it. So my hope is that when, that Biden's not going to go into the office and he's just going to say, this is the Trump's ban on racial sensitivity training, and then he's just going to cancel it. If anyone actually reads actual text of the executive order, I don't see how anybody can actually be against what it says as written. So I think that'll be a good sort of test to see if Biden does just sort of overturn it, because that'll be indication that it's more of a just a political partisan gesture than it is anything to do with actually engaging with the ideas that are on it. You know, it's more of a posturing than actually looking into the laws that it protects.
Yeah, I think you're right. And what concerns me is that we live in an era where people get their news and their information from 30-second now this clips. So based on whatever they decide to put on it, that's effectively going to be the information that most people retain, because most people, and this is going to sound very elitist and very pompous, and I'm sorry, but most people don't actually really dig too much deeper into these issues than we would like. But legislatively speaking, should the government have a say in banning these sort of ideas? Because the argument against this, and you know, they're not, as you said, they're not banning it, they're reducing federal funding from universities that promote this sort of nefarious ideology, stuff like that. But should the government have any say in doing any of this? Because as I said before, one problem, number one, we have the problem of this being politicized, but two, what a lot of people would say, and I've had conversations with these people, is that the first thing that we need to do is we need to make a cultural change first before we make a legislative change, where the government recognizes, it takes the temperature of society and it says, okay, these are the values that the people have now. Now we can institute change, because otherwise the problem still persists. If you travel back, way back when, and if you were to say, okay, let's just immediately ban slaveholding, or let's immediately ban racism, you know, with some metric that was in proportion to what was going on at the time, people would have said that probably would have actually set it back up, because the problem still persists there. You still have that cultural problem in which most people still hold those beliefs. And if anything, because people have this tendency to immediately go against what the government believes, then you might have actually amplified the problem. So do you think that the government should have any say in forming any sort of legislation? Should we wait first to have a cultural change before we make any actual policy-driven stuff? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I see the banning of the whole critical race theory idea is sort of similar to almost like a separation of church and state issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are ways you can go about doing racial sensitivity training and things like that that don't involve critical race theory whatsoever. You can still acknowledge racism exists without agreeing with critical race theory. You can still take steps to combat racism without agreeing with anything in critical race theory. The main issue with CRT is that it's sort of a conspiracy theory in itself. It requires sort of this belief in these really vague, untestable, unfalsifiable concepts of, white privilege and, looking at endpoints and disparities and using that as de facto evidence that there's racism within the structures of society. It's just a really bad way to go about trying to combat racism, because it never actually is well defined in any way. They don't offer any ways that it can be measured to know if it's present or absent in any situation. And there's no way you can then quantify it over time to see if any policies that we're making are actually working in reducing quote unquote systemic racism in society. So unless something is really defined extremely well, that we can know how to measure it, know when it's there, know when it's not, know when we can cancel some programs because things are getting better. I just can't sign on to a sort of all-encompassing ideology that is driven largely just by people's strong emotions and faith, and everyone wants to do something and they think this is what's kind of being offered up on the left. And it's all good intentions, but we actually need to look at what the ideology is saying, and before we decide to make anything law. This is why I don't think things like intelligent design should be taught in science classrooms or promoted in the government, because they're unfalsifiable, untestable, and we need things that are grounded in solid science before we can actually adopt things at a federal level.
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with a friend of mine a few days ago about this, and it was he was one of the individuals. I can speak very freely about this around. And we agreed on many things, including the idea of social justice. But he's more woke, and my argument with him was I I don't argue with your ends, but I really have to question your means of coming back to the solution. And with the means of CRT, that's not going to get the results anyone wants. But what's so alarming about it is that very few people really know what it is. It's marketed as diversity training, but it's anything but. I think James's stance on this is on Trump's ban on critical race theory was that it wouldn't in itself solve the problem, but as you said earlier, Colin, that like it really forced it named critical race theory. When we saw the first debate between Trump and Biden, Chris Wallace identified it by name. It could at least get some gears in people's minds turning and say, "Oh, what's that?" Or whatever. It forces the conversation. It can make the phenomenon identified by the public eye. Now, I don't know if that kind of conversation is really going to happen anytime soon, because you see on Coleman Hughes's podcast that he requested a conversation, a good faith conversation with Ibram Kendi, but Kendi, to my knowledge, has not responded or acknowledged Coleman in any way. And I, unfortunately, am of the thought that we have to let critical race theory run rampant to some degree right now to cause some flat out obvious destruction before people step up and say, whoa, this is going way too far. So, I don't see the conversation necessarily coming into the public eye. But on the other hand, we do see prominent people starting coming up. You see this lady in the UK who gave a actual address against critical race theory. We see someone like Glenn Greenwald, of all people, taking a stand at least against cancel culture. Now, it'd be it'd be really nice to see him apologize to Sam Harris. I don't know if we'll see that, but we even see Andrew Yang come out on CNN saying, like, look, the Democrats cannot run a campaign simply screaming and crying to people to say to live a certain way without debating and discussing with people the validity of their ideas. You just can't do it. You're just going to turn people off. So I'm not clear on whether or not that conversation will happen. Is it here now, or are we in limbo? Like, where do you think we stand on that spectrum? It does seem like a pushback is coming, but is it here, or is it just is it really not?
Yeah, I think the conversations are happening a lot, and I think a few years ago nobody was talking about it, and now I see more and more people talking about this. I don't know if I can't remember her name, but her Twitter is like this Smith College Big Dig. She is a faculty member. Sorry, she's a staff member at Smith College. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but she recently came out with these whole revelations about, since 2018, how the college had been sort of racially discriminating against people based on, just them being white, basically, and silencing people. And she's extremely brave, and she started making these videos just highlighting all of these various ways that Smith College has been sort of violating, creating a toxic work environment for people just if they don't agree with this stuff. And we're seeing more and more of these people every day that are just coming forward and being brave enough to speak about these things. So I think a lot of ways people are seeing other people stand up and speak out, and that's encouraging others to speak out, because at the end of the day, we have sort of a collective action problem. We have a situation where it's more dangerous to speak out the fewer people who are already speaking out, and so it's this it's going to be a frequency dependent thing. So the more people that are speaking out about it, the more people are going to feel like they can speak out about it too, because other people got their back, and it's now more of a mainstream position to take, to push back. And the more people that speak out, the harder it is for them to cancel any single individual that's doing it. It's really easy to shout someone down and silence them when someone just stands up, in a crowd that's being silent. They're an easy target, but the more targets there are, the more they can't just focus all of their hate on one individual and pile on like they used to be able to. So I'm really encouraged that people are going to be speaking up, because I think that's how the change takes place. That's how the minds are changed. That's how people who are holding the same ideas or the beliefs that we have, that critical race theory might not be the best way to go about things, I think that's a prevalent view, but people aren't really willing to speak up about it. So it's good that people who hold these beliefs see these beliefs being stated in very bold terms by a lot of other people. So I think things are going to improve. They might still get worse before they improve, but I think those will just be sort of the the death rattle of critical race theory. Their last, we get them cornered, and their backs up against a wall. They're going to start flailing more. So that might just be what we see when things start getting a lot worse. Hopefully.
Yeah, we're even seeing. I usually tell this story where I have many conversations, or I've had many conversations with professors at my university, in which behind the scenes they're very openly anti against this really strange phenomena that is occurring on college campuses, where if you look at the statistics that come out, more than half of all college students think that they should be sheltered from ideas they don't like. They're in favor of this idea of cancel culture, however you choose to define it. And professors behind the scenes, many of them are openly, or not openly, sorry, they're privately against this, but they want to be openly against this. And we're seeing, I agree with you, we are seeing more and more people speak out against this. Just about a month and a half ago, you had this article, this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from a theoretical physicist who didn't ever really, he a public figure, he never really talked about cancel culture, but he's talking about it now because he's seen it spread into the hard sciences. But at the same time, I also see the people who are on the woke side, more and more people are also joining their side. Well, I've seen more and more people on my Instagram post who were usually filled with completely apolitical people just 5 years ago. Now they're becoming, in a way, I don't like using this term, but just for the sake of it being a good example of what I mean, they seem to be becoming radicalized by this notion of social justice and on what side we ought to be on in history. And so what I'm getting concerned about is that, yes, indeed, more and more people are openly speaking out against this stuff, but at the same time, more and more people are joining it. And this is only increasing the level of polarization that we're seeing in America. And, Ezra Klein wrote a great book about this, Why We're Polarized, just a few months ago. And another one, but Matt Taibbi wrote it called Hate Inc. And I think that we're at a dangerous point in history right now. Regardless of what your thoughts are on who should have won the election, whether there was or wasn't voter fraud, regardless of all that stuff, we've become so politically and culturally divided that I can understand the arguments made by someone like Brett Weinstein, who's saying that, things cannot continue this way. A society that continues this way is extremely unstable. I can totally see that. And I can't come up with a good way for people to be united. There are arguments that some people make, whether it be, the return of religion into people's lives, or the making of, making populism more institutionalized. I think those are pretty bad examples, either because they lack a decent understanding of human nature or of how the political process actually works. But have you yourself actually thought about any potential solutions? How do we lower the temperature of this sort of thing? It seems like I'd like to say we're at the tipping point, but I've been saying that for the past couple of years, and I've been just continuously been proven wrong on that.
Yeah, I mean that's the main problem, is that every time you get more people that are being bold and speaking up, that's always interpreted as, by the people who are the critical theorists, as sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that these are the racists who are now being more emboldened, and now we need to double down even more hardcore on our ideas. And then they double down on their hard ideas, and then more people see how woke these people are, and then they respond with being even bolder. So yeah, it's just a polarization machine that's going on. I don't know if there's any quick fixes to it. I don't, president's not going to change the whole thing. In a way, I just think it needs to sort of run its course in a way. I think that a lot of these social justice ideas, we can only hope that they're just not as faddish as the new generations come up. We need to just keep saying what we're saying about how, we're not racist by criticizing critical race theory. It's going to be, we need to be able to change minds at some point, have open conversations with people, be as cordial as we possibly can. And that's not an answer that people like to hear. They want a quick fix, but I don't see any quick fix to it. You're not just gonna change minds overnight at all. It's going to be it just needs to be a full court press of people trying to get out there and having those difficult conversations, and ultimately this not not caring anymore when people call them horrible names. It's really difficult to do. When I first came onto Twitter and started speaking up, I'd get piled on Twitter and like my heart would start pounding. It was so much anxiety that I'm just like, oh my God, I'm going to ruin everything. And then over time, the more you speak up, you sort of get used to it. It's sort of that anti-fragility or concept where, the more that you're subjected to, being tarred and feathered, the more you sort of get inured to it, and you kind of grow thicker skin. And now to this day, I mean, I'll tweet things and it doesn't bother me whatsoever. I was called a Nazi the other day, and it's whatever. That's just Tuesday now. And I think that's what it needs to be. And people just need to realize that even though there are consequences depending on your job, I mean, these people need to take into account their situations before they just start going off on Twitter or being public about things. But yeah, it's not. I don't think there's a quick fix, and this is sort of where I depart from people like James Lindsay, I think, and he thinks we need to have Trump as the presidency, that we can't have a Democratic president whatsoever. And I see his arguments and where he's going with these things about how he doesn't want to have wokeness get in the government because once it's in, it just entrenches itself. And like these are all true things, but at the end of the day, like you're only buying yourself time that ultimately has to be sort of a slow cultural change. So yeah, I mean, maybe having a Republican president would be good to sort of buy our time to get some stopgaps in the way to mitigate the spread of sort of critical theory through the government, because that's just a nightmare waiting to happen. But yeah, no quick fixes. Just got to be doing what you're doing, having people on podcasts talking about them. Try not to be a total ass when you're engaging with people.
Mm-hmm.
Just be the most zen person in the room when you're discussing these things. You just can't let it get to you. You can't call people names, and yeah, just change people's minds. Stuff.
Particularly challenging for me because I grew up and was raised in a very, very liberal area, and I'm still liberal myself. But when I see wokeness come into play, that drives me insane.
Me too.
And we have the election, and it's being heavily contested right now. But my real worry now is that I don't think the woke left has learned anything. I think the social justice extremists is, that's my term for the woke, is going to just keep pushing, and the insanity of the woke are just going to set us up for failure again. Like I said earlier that there's an argument to be made for reforming the police, but like they decided to label it as defund the police. And when the New York Times article came out saying like, yes, we actually do mean defund the police, well, great, you almost shot us in the foot. Now, because of this, I don't think Trump is going to go away anytime soon. I think a refusal to tamp down the excesses of the woke left is just going to add fuel to the fire. It's going to paint liberalism in a very, very bad light. And Trump's not out of the game. I think he's going to stick around, and I believe there's even talk that he might run again in 2024. So we're in a circumstance. Yeah, I feel you. We're in that circumstance. We have to admit that like we're watching two movies, and if I had it my way, I for this election cycle, I would have liked to have seen Unity 2020 truly take flight and have us have a centrist party, center left and center right, to run the country for a while. I thought that was a good way. That might have been a good way to save it, but bottom line, it just became too late. And from watching The Hill, it seems like the majority of Americans do want a third viable option, and it seems to be socially acceptable for us to create that third or fourth or whatever option. And right now, there's probably no institutional power behind it, but there's definitely some social momentum. Is there room for a third option at this moment? A third, even the third narrative?
I think there's room for a third narrative. I mean, we're seeing it on sort of the alternative media networks, and if you look at more mainstream media things, you don't really see a third narrative very much at all. But I mean, things like Joe Rogan's podcast is the biggest podcast, the biggest talk show, I think, in the world. So there's definitely an audience that is getting other ways to think about things. It's just, whether or not that can be sort of translated another level up to the political class. Because, one thing about the Unity 2020 thing is that they did identify that the problem is that the whole duopoly and how to crack into that. But you have to crack into it with the same, using the tools that we have right now. Well, it has to be within the system, because you can't just change the entire system overnight and have a viable third party that's going to take hold. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to know if a centrist candidate can win, really, because the primaries push each side to their sort of extremes, acts as sort of a first filter. I mean, maybe not completely. I mean, we have someone like Joe Biden who won, and he's a pretty centrist Democrat by almost every measure. So yeah, I mean, I'm not the best political analyst in the world, so I hope we can have some more temperate minds rise to the top. It's really going to be a test, I think, in 2024 to see sort of where each party, where their headspace is. Do we go down the Trumpism route on the right, where it's just sort of this more of a aggressive posturing, and on the left, do we go towards that more sort of the woke critical theory, social justice types? Yeah, I guess we'll see. Hopefully, we get some good selections with both parties, so we can actually have a different way. And if Trump runs again, I think that would just be nightmarish, because again, it's just, we're not voting for a candidate. People are going to be voting against one now, and just the polarizations would be out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, two things I think were definitively proven during this election cycle. One is that Trump is way more popular than people expected him to be, and he ignited this sentiment, this anti-establishment sentiment among people on the right that I don't think people were expecting, because populism was always popular on the left, but now we're seeing it rising with the Tucker Carlson view of right-wing populism. So I think that's one thing that we obviously learned. The other thing that I think we obviously learned is that Trump can run in 2024 and possibly win, because he did incredibly well. He did better than he did when he ran against Hillary. And so I don't think this is the last time we're going to see him. He said that if he loses, that we'll never see him again. But knowing the type of person that Trump is, I think that's unlikely, to say the least. But I want to also ask you about the sort of tactics that we should employ, because the obvious thing would be, as you said, yeah, let's be cordial, let's be understanding of the other side. The very sort of things that you learn in straight epistemology, I think we can all agree those are probably good tactics. But what about things like, should we play by some rules so people don't sort of quote unquote other us? So do we platform people who, do we not platform people who were accused of sexual misconduct, even though there's strong evidence that they didn't do anything wrong, strictly for not associating ourselves with people who are very much anti-Me Too movements? Do we not platform people who are explosively controversial, someone like Milo Yiannopoulos? Because that guy is, say what you will about him, he is without a doubt a huge target for the woke crowd. And or do we also have to make some concessions before we talk about critical race theory, saying like, yes, we recognize that systemic racism can and does exist. We recognize the history of redlining. We recognize the history of socioeconomic policies that affected the status of the current black person. We recognize all that stuff. But can we also talk about this ideology that is sort of places a victimhood expectation on all these people? So should we make concessions? Should we sort of play by some sort of rules in which we don't platform people who are controversial or who have been Me Too'd, even though it probably would be the right thing to do so, I guess, on a principled status? Or do you think that we should like look, there's some things, if we want to convince people, like there's some things we have to concede? I hope that was a clear enough question.
Yeah, I don't really like the playing the game of, who we're gonna who we're going to platform, who we're not going to platform, who do we talk to, who are not, because everyone has sort of different thresholds for what they think is acceptable for who can be platformed. I mean, a year ago, I was on Glenn Beck's show we did like a 8-minute interview, and Glenn Beck, he was, I think, a little crazier back in the day when Obama was president. By that I mean a lot crazier. But I still disagree with a lot of stuff he says, but it was a great interview. He was super cordial. He was extremely thoughtful. But I had so many people, and I posted it on Twitter. They're just like, "How dare you go on Glenn Beck? Like you're just a horrible person for doing this." They didn't think Glenn Beck was even in the appropriate list of people of people I could talk to. So I just don't like playing that game. I think if people are serious about talking about issues, they're probably not going to want to platform someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, because by every standard, he's sort of a troll provocateur. He's not interested in actually talking about the ideas. I mean, maybe 10% he is, and then the other half is him just sort of posturing, trying to create a brand and things like that. Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, we're going to need a diversity of tactics. There's not like any one method that we all need to adopt in order to progress our cause. You're going to have the people who know law very well. The people that Chris Rufo, he talks to, that he's got some lawyers that know how to do law, so they can try to do the critical race theory and law thing. And there's people like James Lindsay who are going after the foundational, the underpinnings of the ideology and criticizing critical theory itself and postmodernism. Like, we need those people. I do some of that, but I tend to tackle the whole, sex and gender things and sex denialism, and talk to people about the biology behind what biological sex is and why it's not a spectrum. So we need sort of everyone to do what they're really good at, because I'm not going to be the best person at, debunking postmodernism. I'm trying to get better at it, but it's just not exactly my wheelhouse. And then I can't expect someone who's tackling that, like Helen Pluckrose, might not be the best person to tackle why biological sex is not a spectrum. There's different people have their different strengths. You're a good interviewer, so you're doing what you can do on your podcast and get ideas out there, and so you're speaking to your strengths. So I think both of you are doing that, and this is basically what people need to do: just find out what you can do to contribute the best way you can, and just try to do that.
I think that's a great way to word it, and thank you so much for those kind words. So would you say that therefore, should everyone therefore be open to conversation? One of the people, someone might say, someone who is very much pro free speech and all that jazz, maybe someone could say, yes, everyone should be open to these conversations, but the one exception are probably grifters. And it's very difficult to determine who is and isn't a grifter, because usually it's just based upon a pattern that some people perceive. And even then, if there is a suspicious pattern, it could just, be the fact that maybe they are just very much on the left, or maybe they are just very much on the right. But let's just say, for the sake of this argument, that we know for a fact, definitively, someone is a grifter, and they've openly admitted it privately that they're only saying the things that they're saying because it makes them the most amount of money. Should we entertain going on their platforms? Should we take them seriously at all? Because one of the things that comes up in my mind is, well, at the very least, I would go on their platform, not for them, because they're a lost cause, they're just doing whatever their audience says, but at the very least, I could be a bridge for their audience towards different ideas, some oppositional viewpoints, a more accurate understanding of what the other side would believe. At the very least, maybe I could change the dynamic of his audience in some meaningful way. So what do you think of that? Are there some people like grifters that should be out of the equation of conversation, or pragmatically, should everyone be there?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a judgment call for each individual person, and if there's probably a grifter, non-grifter is probably more of a spectrum than a binary. So, yeah, I mean, I would tend to just gravitate towards the idea that we should be having more conversations with everybody. That's not to say that, I mean, I'm sure there's some people I wouldn't talk to, like if David Duke had a podcast, I'm not about to go on his and, we agree that critical race theory is bad. Like, I'm not going to give him props for that or something. And that's not going to help me whatsoever. and it's going to be detrimental to my cause if I'm
Right.
on a podcast with someone like that.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, basically, conversation is all we have. When conversations moved off the table, I mean, what do we have left? We just have, I mean, violence is basically the only thing that's available at that point. When words run out, then you start throwing fists. And so this tendency for people to want to deplatform people and not talk to anybody, to me, that's just like a recipe for disaster. That's how the temperature just keeps rising and rising, because when conversations fail and fail, people are more likely to start taking a swing at people, because that's the only way you can resolve certain issues at the end of the day, if you're not going to actually have a conversation, or at least attempt to have one. So
Mhm.
so yeah, across
Yeah.
the board, be more open to having conversations. That doesn't mean talk to everybody, but yeah, it's going to be a judgment call for every individual. Some people are more obviously trolls and grifters, and yeah, just do your best. People are going to mess up, and they should be given the benefit of the doubt, but um, yeah.
You brought up a really interesting point there, actually, that I want to capitalize on. You probably wouldn't go on someone like David Duke's podcast because, yes, we're both against critical race theory, but probably for different reasons. Another one that I often think about is that some people who try to join the cause, the anti-wokeness cause, are very much devout Christians, and their reasoning behind what should be the solution towards this woke craze is that we should go back to religious institutions, declare Jesus Christ as the epitome of the figure that we should aspire towards. And so I'm perfectly happy with joining forces with people that I disagree with, Ali and myself with those sorts of people, perfectly fine. What worries me sometimes, and what I think about, is that if they have a completely different diagnosis of the problem, and which leads them to a completely different potential solution, are we even allies if we're diagnosing something for completely different reasons? It's like we're looking at the same situation, but we're coming up with completely different analysis. So should I still sort of just join them and use them for as much as possible? Not use them, that's a very bad word, but just sort of join them as much as I possibly can, to as much as our agreements allow us to? Or should I just have a conversations with them, obviously, but sort of debate them, both of them, the woke person as well as the anti-woke Christian person who thinks that religiosity needs to increase to solve the problem? That's a difficult solution for me.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, it's really tough, because I'll get into arguments with people and I'll say, that biological sex is a binary, there's only two sexes, and then I'll get people who are scientifically minded who say, the biology and why that's true. But then I'll also get people who will comment and say, yeah, because God made only man and woman, Adam and Eve, and that's why sex is binary. And it's just like, well, not exactly. Like we're at the same, we both have the same like belief at the end point, but how we got there is wildly different. I've been criticized for promoting Chris Rufo, because he, I guess, was getting some money from the Discovery Institute, which, if you know anything about them, they were sort of big in funding the creationism intelligent design movement in the sort of late 2000s. And, I had an essay called The New Evolution Deniers, where I criticized people on the left for denying evolution. And then here I am promoting Chris Rufo, who's getting paid by this organization that was one of the most anti-evolution organizations that there is. So it's going to be really complex in who you stand with. I think you can do two things at the same time. You can sort of form a strategic alliance with certain people if the endpoint is kind of where you need to get to, but you shouldn't ever stop criticizing the bad ideas that people have. And on certain issues, like people like Chris Rufo and a lot of other people who don't like critical race theory, a lot of maybe religious people who I find myself sort of in the same circles with now for some reason, they tend to have a pretty good idea of why it's wrong, for the same reasons that I hold it's wrong, or why postmodernism is bad for the same reasons I think it's bad. I've talked to a few evangelical Christians who are very good at sort of biblical literary interpretation, and that's sort of what a lot of woke people are trying to do. That's all critical theory is basically this hyper analytical literary interpretation. And a lot of these evangelical Christians can point out all the tactics that the critical theorists are doing, because to some degree they've been doing those things too, but they also realize they're coming at it from a completely different like epistemological framework too. So they actually can contribute to helping identify the flaws with things like postmodernism. So yeah, I find that these strategic alliances are overall pretty useful. But at the end of the day, you still need to be able to call out the bad ideas and why they got there. I'm much more willing to collaborate with someone who agrees that the idea that something like critical race theory is wrong for the same reasons I think it's wrong, even if they happen to be sort of an evangelical Christian evolution denier. Like I can put that aside and work with them on other topics. It is more difficult if they believe something is wrong and we arrive at the same endpoint, but for completely different reasons, because there's usually another agenda that they have behind that could, I guess, you risk that sort of taking over as the narrative. And then you risk people who are opposed to you associating you with those individuals who are, holding those bad beliefs. So that doesn't look good either.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem, and anyone who's listening to this, I'm perfectly willing to have conversations with just about anybody. I'm friends with people who are Republicans, like Thomas Sheedy is the founder of Atheists for Liberty, great guy. I'm good friends with him. He's a Republican. I'm about as far as being a Republican as you can probably get. Still perfectly fine with being friends with someone like him. I'm perfectly fine with being friends who are devoutly religious. It's this, James Lindsay, I think, worded it brilliantly, and I think it was the way that he worded it that made me change my mind on this, where originally for pragmatic reasons, just strategic reasons, I said maybe only sort of associate with people publicly in a way that wouldn't associate you in a negative light with other stances. What he said was, the thing that we cannot lose the ability to do is make friends. That's the one, like, as a social species, we have to be able to continue to make friends with people who disagree with us. Not making friends with people who, like, promote genocide or anything crazy like that, but really just people who, they have completely, radically different viewpoints than you, sure. But they're, remind yourselves that no one is the villain in their own story. Everyone's under the expectation that what they believe will ultimately increase the well-being of society. And so long as you recognize that and you're able to have conversations with them without speaking past one another, I think we can get somewhere. I think we can converge at some values, and through time and through dialogue, we might eventually be able to agree. But this idea that we have to isolate ourselves from people who disagree with us because you think their views are dangerous, and if people adopted their views, we'd live in a worse off society, so therefore we should try to drown out those views, hoping that no one will be able to see them, I think that's incredibly unstable. I don't think society can work that way. And if that's the way that we're going, which I'm concerned that might well be, then I think we have reason to worry. So that's why I'm very happy when I see podcasts such as, hopefully yours in the future, come out, and websites like New Discourses. I'm very happy that these things are becoming more and more popular. And I hope that eventually they will turn the tide.
Yeah, it's actually been amazing how, since I used to, rail against creationism, intelligent design. In a lot of ways, those evangelical Christians were very much sort of like the enemy for me in a lot of ways. And now I find myself having excellent conversations with those same people because we sort of are united by this other cause that we see as bad, and it's been really, really refreshing to talk to these people. I don't know if you know Paul Vanderclay. He's a preacher. He's got a church in Sacramento, and he reached out. I went on his podcast, and then since he lives so close, I went to his congregation, and we had a really great chat with him and everyone, and it was one of the best conversations I've had in a long time. And these are, for all intents and purposes, this was like enemy territory. Would have felt like it for me, over a decade ago. But yeah, it's to me, it's rehumanized a lot of people that I had previously had written off as like, oh, these people are, they're just totally gone. They're just ideologues. They're stupid or whatever. And it's been fantastic. But now I see sort of the woke crowd. They're doing the same thing to me now. I'm sort of the evil other person, and I'm still willing to talk with them, but they don't want to talk to me. And now I'm just sort of a bad guy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, having those conversations is just the best way to just humanize everyone and realize that we're all just complex people who have different opinions, and that's perfectly fine. Let's hash it out. And yeah, that's basically how I try to approach things.
But yeah, Dr. Wright, I want to thank you endlessly for coming on the podcast, and I hope to normalize using Dr. Wright, because it blows my mind that you went through all those years getting a PhD and you're not being called doctor left and right. I would be so angry.
It still feels weird when people say it, just because I'm not used to having people say it. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Of course. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, and we hope to see you again in the future. This was enlightening. This was great.
Yeah, always down to come on. Thank you.